My Encounter with the Hide-Behind by Anonymous. My encounter takes place in Kansas City. I was 19 years old when I happened to encounter something spooky. Sometimes I still can't believe that I even saw anything at all. I live in a small neighborhood with my family. In this small town, where nothing of importance or anything exciting really ever happens, I witnessed something possibly supernatural. I grew up reading about cryptids and monsters and listening to alleged encounters with such entities, but until now, I had never actually seen anything. I still love hearing stories about Wendigo and dogmen, wishing to encounter one. I've always wanted to be the one who saw something. Even if their encounters were dangerous, I wouldn't hesitate to look for one. But I guess I just never got the chance. One evening after work, I was drawing in my bedroom on a freezing night. I usually spend my evenings after work texting my friends and drawing fantasy creatures on my phone to pass the time. At one point, later in the evening, I was reminded by my mom that I needed to take the trash down to the end of the driveway for the garbage truck to pick up the following day. It was a freezing autumn night, and I didn't want to go outside and freeze my ass off, so I waited until I was about to go to bed to take the trash down. We have 5 trash cans that we leave out for the garbage truck, since it's a very big family. I put my jacket on and head downstairs. It's around 11:30 p.m. at this point, and no one else is awake except for me and my dog, Scout. Scout has 2 dog beds, one in the dining room and one by the front door. When I walk downstairs, Scout has her muzzle pressed against the window and is focused on something outside. At the time, I thought it was a raccoon. There was one that lived in the tree on our front lawn. But now that I'm thinking about this encounter, I don't believe that Scout was watching a raccoon. I think nothing about what she might be watching outside, and I head right on out. I walk over in front of the garage doors, grabbing each trash can individually and taking them down to the end of the driveway. I'm putting trash can number 3 down at the end when I hear what I can only describe as a scrabbling noise. It sounds like something is climbing down a tree. Depending on the animal, you can often tell how big it is by the sound when it rises or walks. It didn't sound like a small animal. It sounded rather big, like bare skin on the bark. I turn and see a figure peeking out behind a tree. It's about as tall as me, but the cover of night makes it hard to distinguish this person's facial features or skin color. From the outline that I could see of this person, they were deadly skinny and seemed to be malnourished. I used to be so gullible and tended to make new friends, even with people who didn't like me. It was this gullible friendliness, however, that tipped me off that something was off about this individual. I assumed it was just a homeless person or maybe one of my neighbors. "Hey, sir? Ma'am? What are you doing out at this hour?" I asked politely. The individual in question did not move from their spots, but I could see their breath forming little clouds in the air from the cold. Their left arm was wrapped around the side of the tree trunk facing me, but I could barely make out the outline of its bony arm in the near pitch black of the night. I turned away momentarily and pushed trash can number 3 next to the other 2, and when I turned around, the figure was gone. I was baffled. I had only turned around for a split second, and it had disappeared without a sound. I went over and inspected the tree where it had just been standing. The ground had been disturbed where it had stood, and there was a faint mark on the tree from where the person had wrapped its arm. I looked up at the tree and even pointed my phone light up at it. I finished taking the trash cans down quickly because it was freezing out there, and whatever unidentified person was standing in my front yard only a few seconds ago was gone. To this day, I think I saw one of 3 different cryptids. I think it was either a rake, a skinwalker, wendigo, or maybe like a hide-behind. For those who do not know, a hide-behind is an old cryptid that was allegedly seen by loggers in America's early history. Supposedly, a monster hid behind trees and used the trees as cover to hunt for its prey, humans. Supposedly, people did die to attacks from hide-behinds back in the day, but nothing has ever been verified. Descriptions of the hide-behind vary from being a large reptilian to a big, black, furry beast. To this day, I haven't seen it since, and I kind of want to see it again, even if my initial experience was very creepy. Not a Dog by Colden. Hey Swamp Dweller, I noticed you shared my story in the past, so I wanted to share another experience I had about 4 years ago. I went to a park with my friend. We would often go here and bike down the trails they had. They were quite calming, but all of that changed when we returned to the park. We saw a lot of animals and some kids. One of these animals, though, it looked off. We think it was a dog, but we still don't really know to this day. The dog, or creature, had black fur and extraordinarily long and sharp claws. It jumped on a raccoon and killed it right in front of us. We watched it in disgust as it started to eat the raccoon raw. Then it turned and looked at us, and we got a good look at whatever this thing was. It had big red beady eyes. It started to chase after us for just a second. We dashed away and we got into a yard. I had a pocket knife and I thought that maybe this would protect us if we happened to fall to the ground. But now looking back on it, it definitely wouldn't have done anything. We ended up tripping and scratching our knees up a little bit, but overall we were okay. When we got back home, I grabbed my hunting rifle and sat against the door the whole night. I refused to return to that park alone, and definitely not after sundown. Many people believe what they perceive in the world is reality. Everything they see, touch, smell, and hear is real, and will always be real. This always goes for things that they don't believe in. We live in a world where they no longer fear the monsters in the dark, believing we have discovered all the apex predators of the world, such as the sharks, the orcas, the bears, the wolves, and large cats, and we believe we are on the top of the food chain. While it is true, we currently have no natural predators, we are merely prey of opportunity. This doesn't change the fact that we are prey nonetheless. One doesn't get to experience the feeling of being hunted, of being stalked like a wolf stalks an elk. The feeling of dread you feel as the eyes of a predator are staring into you, waiting for you to make one wrong move. I was 14 at the time. I had short black hair and braces that made me look like the biggest dork you have ever met in your life. Funny enough, I was. While I played lacrosse and was semi-athletic, what I lacked in coordination and speed I made up for with a deceiving amount of brute strength, an amount that didn't make sense for my small stature. I was in Phoenix, Arizona for my annual summer trip to visit my grandparents on my father's side of the family. My grandparents seemed like opposites. My grandfather is a tall, semi-muscular man, standing at 6 feet 6 inches in height and weighing easily over 190 pounds, who never seemed to take anything seriously and loved to crack joke and tease others. My grandmother was tall for a woman, standing at easily 5 feet 9 inches, was rather skinny. She didn't make jokes often, but always seemed to laugh at my grandfather's jokes. The only similarities I ever felt like they really shared was their love for their family, and their love for going on walks and hiking. They also owned a beautiful dog named Lucy. Lucy was a rescue when my grandparents got her, and such, she came with her own issues. She wasn't fond of bigger men and hated big dogs. Yet somehow that didn't seem to stop her from loving any of the men in my family, including my grandfather. If you saw Lucy from a distance, you'd think it was just a large fox. Her fur was the orange color foxes have, and her tail looked just like a fox. In truth, no one knew what breed she was. Even after having become a registered veterinarian assistant, I still have no good guess. The only thing I know for sure is that she at least shares some part of German Shepherd, as she shares the same common characteristics they have, including the medium size, pointy ears, snout, and her love and undying devotion to her owners. The morning after I arrived at my grandmother's, they told me that they were going to hike up Camelback Mountain, a mountain that got its name for looking like a camel's hump. I hated the idea of doing this. Like most high schoolers, I just wanted to lay in bed and watch YouTube, especially since this would be the first year I didn't have my brother Jalen to keep me company. Jalen was my older brother, who had 6 years on me. He had just turned 20 and decided he needed to work to save up money for when he goes back to campus, leaving me to go on a trip by himself. I wasn't upset. Obviously, this is a decision he needed to make, but I was sad about it. Up until 8th grade, he had been my only real friend that I could really rely on and open up to. As I was sitting in the car with my grandmother, I remember staring out the window, admiring the scorching sun, and listening to the steady panting of Lucy in the back. I looked up into the rearview mirror in hopes of seeing her smiling face, instilling confidence in me. I yawned and rolled onto my side, facing the passenger side of the car, and closed my eyes. While I slept, I remember reflecting on the story my grandfather on my mother's side of the family told me a few months ago. These grandparents only lived a few hours south of my family, so I visited them more often. My grandfather, who I will refer to as Papaw to help separate the two, is a short, overweight man who loved his grandchildren more than life itself, but he took a liking to me more than anyone else. I think the reason for this was because I took the time to listen to his story. Papaw had served in Vietnam when he was younger and had numerous stories to tell, a few of which were almost unsettling. He told me of creatures, the likes of which we humans have never seen before, living in the jungles there. He told me how the creature was more dangerous than the Viet Cong soldier or animal or anything like that. He also gave me survival tips in case I ever found myself stuck in the woods and felt unsafe. If you ever feel like you're being stalked by something, do not run. Prey runs. His voice echoed in my head. Don't ever scream, prey screams. If you see the creature stalking you, do not meet its gaze. Most animals take that as you challenging it, and while humans are extremely capable creatures, being able to rely on adrenaline to take down a lot of animals, there are creatures in this world that will butcher us without hesitating. His words seemed to burn themselves into my head. All you need to do is make yourself look as big as possible and walk out of its territory as fast as possible, while still walking. The last of his words echoed as I felt someone shaking my body a little bit. We're here, Josh. It's time to wake up, I heard my grandmother say while rocking my body back and forth. We both got out of the car, and I gave Lucy the treats I had promised her. As I stood outside the car, holding Lucy's leash, I breathed in the fresh air. It smelled quite different from Indiana, as it didn't carry the swamp smell Indiana's humidity usually carries with it. The air was much thinner, making me more confident that I wouldn't be able to run nearly as far as I would be able to at home. As we walked along the trail, my grandmother and I side by side with Lucy leading the way ahead of us, I made idle talk with her as we walked down the trail. The mountains were beautiful. While one would imagine it just to be a barren desert there are specific parts of arid trees and cacti that turn into a sort of forest that, combined with the beautiful blue skies and warm, almost boiling hot weather, made it a beautiful day to hike. As we continued to walk, I felt this sense of dread growing inside of me. The further we went, I looked down to Lucy, whose ears were now up and alert. Her body was low to the ground. She sensed something near us. I began to feel uneasy. The mountains of Arizona had many creatures inhabiting it, which include black bear, mountain lions, elk, deer, javelina, coyote, antelope, along with a lot more. I looked at my grandmother, who didn't seem bothered at all. This feeling of dread grew bigger and bigger, the weight of it sitting on my chest. Something was staring at me. I could feel it piercing my soul. I recalled my papa's advice and attempted to make myself look as big as possible, which admittedly wasn't very big at all. My goal was to make myself seem like I just wasn't worth the trouble. I looked around, trying to spot anything out of place when I saw it. Peering around from behind a cactus was some sort of creature, covered in black fur. I couldn't see its body because it was behind the giant cactus, but I could tell it was easily as tall as this cactus was. This thing was easily 7 feet tall. I tried to avoid its gaze, not wanting to accidentally challenge it, but it felt as though my eyes snapped to them on their own. Its eyes were black. Not black, but more like they were completely void of light, except for a small amount of yellow. Their eyes were beady and honestly soulless. The longer I looked, I noticed this giant hand reaching around the front of the cactus. Its hands was big enough to fit my head inside of it, and it had 2-inch claws at its fingertips. My head snapped away from it, and I looked ahead. "Grandma, we need to turn around and leave," I said, trying not to show fear, but wanting to get the urgency across. "Oh, but we haven't made it halfway yet," my grandmother said with the sound of sadness in her voice. I needed to come up with something to get us out of there. I looked down to Lucy, who was still walking forward, but her head wasn't looking ahead. She was looking at my right, the direction I saw the monster watching us from. "Grandma, I don't feel good. My stomach hurts and I feel nauseous. Can we please just go back? I promise we can take Lucy on a walk a little bit later," I said, trying to sound as sick as possible. "I guess that is fine," my grandmother said almost disappointingly, as she really wanted to take me to the peak this year. When we turned around, I made sure to keep myself between where I had seen the monster and my grandmother. As we walked back down, feeling the dread continued to get worse. This feeling of hopelessness, that you are no longer the scariest out there anymore. That at any moment's notice, something could decide to take you out of this world. When we got back to the car, I noticed we were still the only ones out there, which is strange, as it was usually a place to go hiking that was very popular. Lucy reluctantly got back into the SUV, preferring to stay outside and keep watch while my grandmother got in the car. While I finally got Lucy in, and I got myself in, I looked ahead on the trail. There was something, somewhat obscured by the foliage. It was a hulking animal of some sort. It had the face of a dog with its long black snout, but was easily bigger than any black bear I'd ever seen before. It stared at me, into my soul once again, but it never moved, only stared at me, which was almost scarier than it charging us. We went back home, where I sat in my room and immediately called my papa. Honestly, he would be the only one that would believe me. 2 days later, my grandmother told me she had seen something weird on the news of a few hikers going missing on that very same trail. She thanked me for convincing us to leave. I still have never, ever gone back to those mountains. Even as I've gotten bigger and more experienced hunting and such, I just don't trust it. I now carry a serrated pocket knife that my papa had given me for my 15th birthday everywhere I go. I will never forget the advice he had given me. The Michigan Gator Man? By Certified Burger. Now, before I begin this story, let me first start by clarifying that alligators are not native to Michigan, which is what made me so skeptical about believing this legend until I had an in-person encounter with him. The Michigan Gator Man. A little backstory on my family. We recently purchased a house in a small town in Michigan's Upper Thumb. Caseville, Michigan was a quiet beach town famously known for its cheeseburger festival. It seemed like a family-friendly town and a perfect place to spend summers. Everything was excellent the first year or so of living there, and then we began to hear whispers around town about the legend of what I was supposed to believe was the Gator Man. We figured it was some form of hazing that people did to new people in town and brushed it off. On the 4th of July, the town had fireworks, and about 12 of us decided to sit on the sand to view them. Our street had access to a private beach, so we were the only ones there that night. Everyone else was on the public side of the beach in the distance. My cousins and I were having a great time, actually, dancing to the music and just goofing off in general. Then, we hear something coming towards us in the distance. It's a low growling sound. We stare, but we don't see much because it's very dark along the water. Either way, there's a big group of us, so we weren't too terribly threatened by it. At this point, the crickets stopped chirping, and any voices in the distance became muted. Even the waves of Lake Huron seemed to hush. It became dead silent. My cousin Kurt points toward a low growling sound, and he says that there were 2 yellow glowing eyes growing in size as something was coming towards us. The loud crash of fireworks pulled our attention away from whatever it was, and when we looked back, it was seemingly gone. We began watching the fireworks show and soon forgot all about it. Our attention is pulled away from the fireworks as sand flies over our heads from behind us. All of us whip our heads around to see it. A figure of a man stands in the dark. Only once the flash of fireworks illuminates him enough to see what he truly is. His skin seemed to glow in the light. He looked skinny, almost scaly. We couldn't get a great look at him because of our light source. It was flashing in and out, of course. The grand finale of the fireworks began and we glanced away for just a split second. And suddenly, a splash of the water happened. This weird man was gone. After the fireworks show ended, we all decided this was pretty creepy and didn't stay at the beach for much longer. I tried to rationalize how he looked in the light, and maybe just thought he had a nasty sunburn or some sort of, skin burns or something like that. The following day, we headed back to the beach to look for any evidence that could bring some sense to the situation, and just to be safe, we got our dog with us. What we found made our skin crawl. Leading from the sand to the water was what I could only describe as gator tracks. But here's the kicker. A piece of driftwood was floating in the water next to where the tracks led, and it looked to have some sort of odd scratches and bite marks on it. I moved to get a closer look, and my dog instantly began growling and refused to walk any closer. This made me uncomfortable enough to listen and to head back to the house as fast as possible and get as far away from these tracks as I could. That night, my cousin and I decided to go back to the beach for an evening swim, but mostly to look for the gator man. I now understand that this wasn't the brightest idea, but we were bored and wanted to figure this thing out. We reached the sand, using our phone flashlights to look for any sort of evidence, but we didn't find anything interesting, so we swam in the water. We were in the water until our cousin felt something brush up against her leg. As our initial shock was settling in, our eyes began adjusting to the dark water. We saw some air bubbles and immediately felt the tension in the air. A tall figure slowly emerges from the water in the moon's light. Those same yellow glowing eyes met mine for a not-so-appreciated second time. He was angry, and we needed to leave this water. We knew immediately this was his beach, and he had the upper hand, especially in the water. We booked it back to the house, never looking back to see if it was following us. I still can't visit that beach to this day. I still see those glowing yellow eyes when I close my own. I don't know what the Michigan Gator Man wants, but I feel sorry for those who find out. Mississippi Dog Man by Pam M. Hey Swamp Dweller, my name is Pam. I live on the northeast corner of Mississippi, less than 10 miles from the Tennessee and Alabama state lines, and 70 miles from the infamous Taylor, Mississippi. My granddaughter, who is 11 years old, had an encounter with a cryptid a few months ago. Let me describe what happened and what she witnessed. Sometime around 11 p.m. we returned home from the county fair here in Alcorn County, Mississippi. My home is approximately 6 miles from town in a relatively rural area containing lakes, trees, and fields used for anything from tomatoes to soybeans and even cotton. My land is almost 20 acres. We have our home, a barn, a shed, and a lake about 200 yards from my house. The rest is trees and a few cleared out pieces. Anyway, back to Saturday night. My granddaughter, A, decided to walk outside to find her kitty before she went to bed. My husband and I were already in bed, and why she went out without waking one of us shocked me, but she didn't wake any of us up. She didn't even wake us up when she returned after seeing this thing. She did get in bed with us and slept with us that night and the next night. However, the following day, while fixing breakfast, she walked into the kitchen and said, "Mama Pam, y'all have some kind of strange dog out there." I asked her what she was talking about, and here is her answer. "When I went outside to find Kitty, I started walking to the front yard and saw something huge and white. I thought it was a dog. But when I got closer, it looked more like an old, bad, skinny grandpa. He was walking on his hands and legs, and then it got up on its back 2 legs. It looked around and it saw me. Then it ran toward the barn. Mama Pam, I ain't never seen anything run that fast." I asked her if she had seen the face of this thing, but she told me that she did not. She didn't get to see it long enough to see any real features. She said it only looked toward her for just a few seconds, and it was too dark to make out any discernible facial features besides that it was bald. I know my eyes were as big as saucers. I knew what she had seen wasn't anything from around here. She told me it was very skinny and again bald, and it looked like it had trouble even walking on all fours, making it hard for her to believe that it could run so fast. She said on all fours it was jerky, but it wasn't like that when it was on just 2 legs. I told them I thought it was a crawler, and could not believe she didn't come screaming for me and my husband to wake up. She said at the time, and in her 11-year-old mind, she didn't consider it harmful because it was frail and seemed to have such a hard time walking. But she did say that when it took off toward the barn, it was lightning fast. She said that's when she got nervous. She returned to bed with my husband and me when she saw how fast it actually was. I know she's telling me the truth because she's never been exposed to anything that would even remotely give her an idea for this story. Not to mention, she doesn't really lie, to be honest, and she slept with me and my husband for the next few nights as well. She's really not a kid to make up things. She's down to earth, a cheerleader, a soccer player, a softball player, and an all-around, well-rounded kid. I hope somebody listening to this in the swamp can answer these following questions. Have any of you ever heard these creatures anywhere else around Mississippi, Tennessee, or the Alabama areas? She has a 4-wheeler, a bicycle, and does a lot of outdoor activities. I'm scared to let her go do those now. Are we in danger? Thanks for sharing my story. Too afraid to go outside by myself now as well. Something Stalked Our Campsite by M.J. Hello, Swamp Dweller, and anyone who may be listening to this. I am a long-time listener, but this is the first story I have ever submitted. It has bothered and spooked me for almost a year now, and I would love any input that anyone has on it. Last year, around June, I was camping in the middle of nowhere, Arkansas, with my boyfriend James and his friend Lane. We were generally having a good time, hanging by the creek, building a fire, and listening to groovy tunes. We continued to hang out into the night and were all partaking in some drinking. This makes the next part of the story seem unbelievable, but trust me, it was just as incredible to us at the time, and we were there. We were all sitting around the fire when James and Lane spotted a small fire off in the distance. This was strange since we hadn't noticed anyone camping nearby all day. We ignored it for a bit and continued having a good time until we all went to sleep around midnight. I remember waking up sometime a little bit later feeling immediately confused and frozen with fear. It was still dark. I turned to James, who was already sitting up and listening intently. I heard sticks cracking just outside the tree line, just outside of the tent. I realized that there was either a person or some sort of creature walking around outside. Couldn't tell you if it was a bear, a wendigo, or some sort of freaking spaghetti monster. All I know is that we sat up, frozen in silence, and unsure if we should be afraid or not. Suddenly I heard someone attempt to open my car door. It was locked. I heard 2 distinct pulls on the handle, and then an urgent whispering. James and I froze. We thought it had to be people at this point, and Lane was alone in his tent about 15 feet away. We sat waiting for whoever this was to leave, with bated breath. I was terrified, because of what happened next. I swear, these voices, they sounded human, but the way they were going back and forth almost made them sound ethereal. This was something weird. The whispers initially started with things like, this was a bust and these guys didn't have anything suitable to steal or something along those lines. Then, we heard a third voice come out of nowhere saying, maybe we check the tents. Frozen in fear again, we waited as long as we could, in full anxiety mode. My mind was relieved that I heard their heavy footsteps approaching the fire that we had seen earlier. Now you might be wondering why I'm sending this in under the cryptid category. Well, that's because in the morning, when we looked out to see if there was any sort of footprints or anything like that, there were none. No footprints, no feet prints, no shoe prints, nothing. Also, when I said that the voices sounded ethereal, it almost sounded like they were whispering right in our ears, but somehow we could hear them all the way across to where our car was. And on top of that, we did hear a lot of rumors about, gnomes, fairies, trolls, all sorts of weird things that are said to roam these sorts of areas. So maybe it was something like that. Or maybe it was just a band of thieves who were incredibly light-footed. I couldn't tell you. What I can say is, though, we were all super freaked out, since those people, creatures, or whatever could have severely hurt us if they wanted to. But we were relieved that they thought of our stuff as worthless or whatever. We decided we would not be camping anytime soon in that area, though. It Came from the Woods by Kate O. My name is Caitlin. I grew up in a small town in Wisconsin. Growing up, my dad used to mention this backyard beast. He didn't tell me what it was until I was about in middle school. A little bit of background before I begin. My dad was unfortunately hit by a drunk driver when he was just 17. The accident resulted in him losing his left leg and thus becoming wheelchair bound. He did still power through and worked a full-time job working third shift. Our house is built into a hill and is connected top to bottom by a duplex that we shared with my grandparents. My parents lived in the bottom half and my grandparents in the top. This bottom half was connected to a garage and patio with doors on the side, facing a patch of woods. I was only a little kid when this happened. I'm currently 22 years old now. Most of the details told to me about this was from my aunt and my father. My uncle was a high school football coach, and my family would attend all the games. My aunt needed to learn the area better, so she'd park her car at my parents' house and get picked up by my uncle. After the game, my family went out for dinner, and my aunt wanted to go home. So my uncle dropped her off to go get her car. My dad and I were the only ones home at this time. My uncle pulled out of the driveway and left. My aunt set her purse down and whatnot and got into the car. Then she looked up and saw a tall creature that, as she described, had many features of a dogman or a werewolf. It was looking in the patio door through the glass. She kept staring at it out of shock, and the creature turned around and noticed her. It started slowly walking towards her car. My aunt buried her head into the steering wheel and, out of fear, waited. After some time went by, she saw the creature walking back into the woods. She turned the car on, floored it out of there, and chased after my uncle, who was already down the road by some good time. Now, this was before the time that everybody had cell phones, so my aunt damn near ran my uncle off the road. When he pulled over to confront her, she was hysterical and said there was a monster at your brother's house, and it was going to kill them. She was screaming at him. My uncle calmed her down and convinced her to drive the rest of the way home. My aunt called my parents' landline and told my dad everything. He immediately goes outside to investigate those woods, but he's never seen anything there. Honestly, I don't not believe her, but it does sound kinda crazy. But at the same time, I have felt like I've been watched from those woods from time to time. Screeching in the Woods by Takea. Hello, Swamp Dweller. It's me, Takea. I have another story to send to you. This story is a bit more, I don't want to say cryptid, but I don't know what else to call it. Anyways, here are the circumstances leading up to my story. I started a new job about 6 months ago, and recently decided to use a couple of weeks of vacation. I felt pretty introverted, so I hunted myself for about 2 weeks. Just my dog Chief and myself. He's a 150-pound Newfoundland dog. Before I continue, Chief really isn't like most Newfies. He was born and has always lived in the bush for what I believe was the first year of his life before I found him, during which he developed incredible hunting skills. I found him caught in my trap lines about 9 months ago. I'll skip over a bunch of stuff to cut to the chase. We bonded very strongly during his recovery. and he is now a robust and healthy farm and guard dog. So I packed my backpack and we set off for northern Ontario. 6 hours later, we finally arrived. A small green car was in the gravel parking lot, but I paid no mind. It's a big forest and the odds are good. I wouldn't even see that car's owner more than likely. I loaded Chief up with his gear, shrugged my backpack on, and shouldered my .73 Winchester. Then we set out. Me and Chief hiked for a few hours, and once we found a nice clearing, I decided to set up camp. Once I had the tent pitched and a small but substantial fire going, I grabbed my mini fishing rod, and Chief and I walked down to the creek nearby to catch supper. While I was fishing, Chief wandered off, and I assumed he was just off chasing a rabbit or something of the like. Later, after I had seen 2 nice fish, I was on my way back to camp when Chief came back with what looked like a deer leg. It still had some meat on it, so I assumed it was from a fresh carcass. The end seemed weird though, as if it had been snapped and twisted off more than pulled and yanked. I let Chief chew away at it for a bit while I cooked the fish. I gave Chief some fish and we enjoyed our meals. Once we finished our supper, we decided to scout where we would be hunting tomorrow. I decided to leave my gun at camp while we looked around, because where we were, it was prohibited to discharge firearms after dark anyway. That being said, I did have my tomahawk and headlamp, and we set off. About 45 minutes later, we had covered probably a mile or so, and at this point, we had entered a small canyon. That's when I heard a gut-wrenching roar that sounded like a woman screaming in agony. I froze, quickly taking my tomahawk out, and Chief crouched and growled. We were ready for a fight. Another roar and a subsequent scream was all I needed, and I took off in the direction I heard the noise. After about 100 yards, I froze, but Chief charged right past me. 30 yards in front of me was a monster. That's the best word I can use to describe the size of this thing. It might have been a grizzly bear, I don't know, but it had the frame of a wolf. It had tight brown skin and thick fur. It was on its hind legs, clawing and roaring at something on the ground. But that was all I saw before I turned and was met with Chief running silently through the leafy brush. However, when Chief knew that I had seen him, he let out his signature deep and menacing growl that had made grown wolves whimper in the past. With this 2-legged devil dog, whatever it was in front of us, it didn't even hesitate briefly. This was all Chief needed, as he was able to sail down, hitting the thing, making it fall over, and running with me to get out of there. I've never seen a more brave dog in my life, but when you get hit with 150 pounds of muscle and meat going full speed, it doesn't matter what you are, you will feel it. After that, we noticed that there was a girl on the ground. Luckily, since the thing was off guard, we were able to pick her up and get her running off with us. Her name was Jenna, and I was able to personally escort her to the nearest hospital. On the way back, we learned that she was a rather avid camper and had been probably in this area multiple times camping. Northern Ontario has forests that are absolutely beautiful, but there are things in those forests that we have never seen before. Whether it's some sort of supernatural monster, some sort of crazy natural amalgamation, or just a weird bear. I don't know, but I don't want to find out. Scary Figure in Upstate New York by Anonymous. So to give you some background information on this story, I would like to start with the fact that I am European. I have shared a couple of stories a few months back about some things that happened to me in Tuscany, Italy. As for my friends and me in this story, we are from Spain, and when this happened at the end of September of 2023, we were pretty new to the United States. I moved here a while back for law school, and so did quite a few of my friends. We had been living here for a few months and decided to explore the nature of this beautiful continent. As well, since we all live in New York City, we wanted to try to get away a bit. So, long story short, we decided to go on a road trip to Canada, driving around Lake Ontario, and then driving back to the New York City area through New York State, upstate. I am a male, and my friends were 3 females. For anonymity, let's call them Lisa, Anna, and Charlotte. Everything was going pretty smooth until the last night of our trip. So, for our last night, we rented an off-the-grid cabin in a remote area of the upstate New York woods. We were half an hour's drive from Harrisburg. Lisa and I decided to spend one night in this cabin because we wanted to be one with nature. The cabin was super old, made from old log woods, and there was no running water or electricity. Both Lisa and I had experience with survival in the wild in Europe. I had been a Boy Scout and a Scout leader for quite some time. All of my friends with me were purebred city girls. They needed to gain some experience with camping or just being in a place where there was no phone service, as was the case with this cabin. We had been driving all day to get there, and when we reached the beginning of the forest, it was already past 10 p.m. and dark that night. While driving to this place, we lost connection with the GPS, so I had to drive to the cabin on intuition paired with good old-fashioned maps, hoping for the best while driving on these muddy, dangerous trails. It was also rainy the whole day. On the way there, Anna and Charlotte in the back of the car had a moment after they lost phone service. They got pretty uneasy for the rest of the ride. Suddenly, in the pitch-black darkness of the forest, we saw a campfire, but there were no houses or people around. It was a well-organized campfire since the fire was not spreading and was not as big as a bonfire. It startled all of us, as we were a little weirded out since there was no one around for miles, and we were deep in the forest. Plus, it was very late at this point. When this happened, we reached the end and figured we had taken the wrong trail at the crossroads. So I turned around and we were on our way again. Half an hour and a couple of wrong trails later, we finally arrived at our destination, where we saw the first glimpse of this god-forsaken cabin in the middle of nowhere. When we arrived, it was still raining, and Anna and Lisa were not in the mood to get out of the car and into the cabin with zero lights or electricity. So me and Lisa left the lights on in the vehicle and went inside the cabin to scope things out. We were using our phone flashlights to check the cabin and to see if we could find any old flashlights, which we were able to. We eventually were able to turn on the fireplace, which didn't work all that well because all the wood was incredibly wet and no one had prepared dry wood anywhere. So, with a couple of old-fashioned flashlights and a small improvised fire I made on the stove, we all got in the cabin. I started making pasta for us. Meanwhile, the girls were preparing the beds and closing the windows since it had already been very cold. The cabin had a small ladder leading to an elevated room or space with a bed where all three girls could fit in. I would take point and sleep downstairs in a bunk bed that seemed older than the First World War. While making pasta, Anna, one of the city girls, came up to me and, knowing that both Elisa and Charlotte did not like to hear anything scary at night, told me that she had seen an old cemetery in the middle of the forest on the way to our cabin, and that she had seen a figure walking around there. I laughed it off at first, as I thought it was nothing. As mentioned in my previous story, I do not believe in scary stuff. Being from Spain, we take promises very seriously. To swear on God is very serious to us, and she swore to God that she was not lying. I told her then and there that I believed her, but there was no need to panic as I would lock all the doors when we would go to sleep. We ate our pasta, made a few s'mores, which were lovely by the way, and drank a few beers. Or at least I did. They all had just one. I can assure you I'm not drunk after a couple of beers, and that I would never start to hallucinate, in case anyone thinks I saw stuff because of the beer. They all went to sleep pretty early after finishing the s'mores and their beer, and I, considering that I love the outdoors and don't mind a little bit of rain, decided to take my last beer and flashlight outside to the porch. It was also made of ancient wood. It felt like it would crash down at any second. I sat myself down with my beer while enjoying the sound of the rain and the lovely sight of not seeing a single light in the distance. I could greatly appreciate this coming from New York City, and I just scanned the area with my flashlight. There was nothing to see besides many trees, a small creek further away, and all I could hear was the wind, the rain, and the water down in the creek. That was until I suddenly heard what I could describe as a weird roar. The first thing that came to my mind was a bear. Now, I had researched well before our trip and knew bears usually kept away from this part of the state. Not to say it's impossible, of course, you never know, but I also know that the bear roar would sound a bit different, as I've heard them quite a few times, and this did not resemble it at all. It was a deep roar, if you get what I mean, but it wasn't the same. I was startled but not scared at this point. I continued to scan the rest of the forest for as long as I could. Then, I saw a glimpse of a figure, well hidden into the tree line. I want to describe the figure as best as I can. It was tall. As a reference, I'm 6'4", and I thought this thing was at least a foot or two taller than me. It was well hidden because of its brown fur. At least I think that's what it was. It could even be skin, in this case. It was blended in very well with the trees of the color of autumn. It was aware of my presence, as I saw two eyes glimpsing into my flashlight. I could not tell you what it was, but I swear on everything I know, it was not a bear. It was bipedal and had relatively long arms. We looked at each other for what seemed like an eternity, but honestly was no more than 5 to 10 seconds before it began to vanish very slowly behind a tree. Then I heard another roar. I felt my hair stand up. I was terrified at this point. I went inside quickly, locked all the doors, and closed all the curtains. I went to bed and tried to wave this off as just exhaustion and anxiety. But when I woke up in the morning, I got breakfast and got the heck out of there. I returned to the city that never sleeps, and I feel way safer here.
I am an avid outdoorsman and a fellow swamp dweller. I was once a well-known outdoor survivalist YouTuber from the early years of YouTube, when 10K subscribers was a lot. So, I won't be using any names just in case a few of you may remember us. This took place in Florida back in 2010 during the summer. Me and two friends were camping on the Alafia River, on a bend in the river not too far downstream from a county park built around a local spring. We loved the spot, and went there frequently in the early years of our channel. The area is much more developed now, and since we made videos out there, the place lost its charm as more and more people have discovered it. We seldom go back now. This particular trip, we decided to camp right on the river in a spot that afforded a beautiful view of it, and the surrounding flora and fauna. To get there, you just had to follow the trail that eventually went down an embankment and turned to run along the river for a dozen yards or so. We usually camped atop said embankment and even had semi-permanent shelter up for a while, but decided to go down and set up camp along the river trail instead. We set up camp, gathered wood, started our fire, cooked, drank, and relaxed. Night eventually fell, and we all turned in around the same time. I believe it was around 10 p.m. or so. We had of course been telling stories of the skunk ape, which is Sasquatch's smaller and smellier cousin from Florida. I have an odd habit of not being able to sleep much when I go camping unless I am the first person to fall asleep. If not, I kind of just doze off and wake up every few minutes. I'm never really ever asleep. In this case, I was not the first one out. I soon heard soft snoring from the other tent shared by my two companions on this weekend trip. So I settled into a comfortable position in my little dome tent and drifted between wakefulness and sleep for a few hours, always keeping an ear out. One thing about rainy Florida summer nights is the sounds of the swamp. Being right off the river, there was a constant cacophony of frogs, toads, crickets, and the odd nocturnal bird, all screaming into the night as they try to get laid. While it can be loud, there is a natural rhythm to it that I enjoyed. There were even some coyotes yipping somewhere off and across the river from us. Suddenly, all the sound ceased. I came fully awake and laid still for just a moment, eyes open as I tried to puzzle out what was off. It was when I heard the gentle trickle of water from the river that I realized everything had gone quiet. I sat up and tried my best to peek out from under the rainfly of my tent, which was covering the screen. I would normally be able to see out of it, but I could not see more than just a sliver. It was so dark outside, it really didn't help anything either. I heard crunching and the rustling of leaves on the embankment above us, in the spot that we would normally camp. I listened for a moment, figuring it was either the raccoon I had chased off earlier with the slingshot, or, even more likely, an armadillo, which was abundant in our area and can make enough noise in the brush to make you think it was a bear charging at you. It was then that I noticed the crunching was following the pattern of a person walking through the brush on two legs, not the slithering rustle of a small game moving around. At this point, I figured either one of my companions was up trying to spook me, or a local had come out and was walking around at night with no flashlight, which was a pretty disturbing and questionable prospect in and of itself. The footfalls moved across the embankment above me towards the top of the trail that led down to where we were. My tent was set up in the grass at the base of the trail, right where it leveled off and turned to follow the river. My companion's tent was set up a few yards away on the left of the trail. The footfalls made it to the top of the trail and stopped. They were maybe 10 or 12 feet away from where I sat. My trepidation grew as seconds passed in eerie silence. There was a sudden loud crack of wood from the embankment above me, the unmistakable sound of a tree branch being whacked and broken against the trunk of a tree. I knew this for certain because we had been doing the same thing earlier in order to break down large dead branches of firewood. Another whack sounded, this time closer to my tent. I reached over and quietly scooped up my large Maglite LED flashlight and my machete. I placed them both in my lap as I sat up. I was sitting cross-legged, waiting patiently. I usually carried a pistol with me, but left it in the car on this trip for a reason I can no longer recall. The footfalls at the top of the trail started again, one after another. This time I could feel the weight of them in the seat of my pants as they came. This thing was heavy. The ground vibrated with the thump under its weight with each step. My skin began to prickle as my neck and ears grew hot with the sudden rush of fear. The footfalls stopped within an arm's reach of my tent. I listened hard and thought that I could make out the faint sound of something breathing quietly. Ragged, in the darkness outside, I knew it was focused on me. The crushing weight of its attention drove me to near panic, as though some long-forgotten instinct woke inside me and knew that I needed to get out of here. It needed me to run. It's the only survival. My breathing grew rapid and shallow, my chest tight as I continued to listen to the dead silence outside of my tent. Then as suddenly as it came, the dreaded weight lifted. I felt and heard the thing move past me down the trail towards my friend's tent. The frogs and crickets resumed, causing me to nearly jump out of my skin at the sudden rush of sound. As the thing moved past me, I was able to will myself to the flap of my tent where I slowly unzipped it enough from the top corner in order to get my flashlight through. I clicked my flashlight on and kept a tight grip on my machete as the bright LED beam lit up the night like a white mini sun. I swept it back and forth and saw nothing of what had just passed. Still too scared to get out, I zipped my tent up and resumed my cross-legged position. For the rest of the night, flashlight and machete held across my lap in case it came back. Dawn came 2.5 hours later. I heard the zipper of the other tent open, so I also emerged. I saw my friend exit his tent, bleary-eyed as he moved off into the thicket of bushes to relieve himself in the pre-dawn light. I approached and asked him if he heard anything last night. He said he did, but he figured it was me walking around trying to creep them out. Told them it wasn't. He kind of shrugged it off and went back into his tent. I stayed outside and searched for signs of the thing, and I found nothing. No tracks or depressions in the ground, no bent or broken branches or twigs, no tufts of fur or hair, nothing. When my companions fully awoke and emerged from their tent for breakfast, I addressed it with them again, and they again said they just thought it was me walking around. I described what I felt, but only got looks of disbelief from them. Something to note about this experience: there was no smell, which is something of a telltale sign of a skunk ape in the other folks' accounts of running into one. The only thing that really points it to being a skunk ape would be the tree knocking, and the one thing that makes me dismiss it as a person was the feeling of dread that it brought with it. I have never felt anything like what I did that night. I had once been stalked by an elusive Florida panther, and it was nothing close to this thing. What was it? I may never know. Hello there. I've been listening to your program for a while and decided to share this. Maybe another listener has had this happen to them, because I still don't really know what this was. I grew up with acres upon acres of woods behind my house. A farmer owned most of it, but no one paid mind to us. There were huge fields on both sides of the woods, and the farmer at one point had trails going through the woods to move cows from one pasture to the other. My brother, sister, and I would regularly be found playing out there. There was a creek back there too. We could fish or swim, or muck-luck, or whatever you want. Muck-lucking is basically playing in the mud, catching frogs and salamanders. We'd been out there in any weather, any season, in the daylight, in the dark, you name it. I used to hike the woods on moonlit nights as a kid, and was quite comfortable in its surroundings. The location of my home was in southeastern Pennsylvania, Chester County. The area still had plenty of open space at the time, and wildlife was really just foxes, raccoon, deer, squirrel, etc. Nothing too scary or aggressive, and the coyotes hadn't come back at this point. I'm about 10 or 11 when this occurred. My friend Haley and I had been hiking for most of the morning, and had gone up through the hills, through the woods, to the top of the pasture. The trees were less there, and they had these huge vines that we used to make swings out of. We had hung out for a while, and then headed back down the hill, towards the woods. The day was sunny and clear, and a really nice autumn day. As we entered the woods and made our way to the trail, the clouds started to move in. It got grayer and a little cold. Nothing major. Haley and I were enjoying shuffling through the leaves, and it sounded like the sound of the leaves were being echoed, like we'd shuffle and something would shuffle behind us. I stopped and told Haley that something was copying me. She shuffled forward and said, "See, I'm not copying you." After she shuffled, we heard the leaves move behind us up the hill a bit, and we both turned to see if it was a deer or something else. But what we saw was something entirely different. It was like a man deer or a deer man or whatever you would want to call it. It was coming right towards us. We know how protective they get, and we knew that the buck could get a little gnarly too. So, as we were looking, we hear the lowest growl that made the hairs stand up on the back of my neck. Haley grabs my arm and we slowly start backing up. I swear on my mother's grave that we backed up. You could see the leaves moving like something was walking through them, but we couldn't see them actually move. It was only about 30 feet away, and we would move behind trees to try to get a better look while backing up. I was trying to rationalize it in my brain by saying it was just a deer. The leaves moved out of the way of whatever was walking through them, and it was large. It kept coming down the hill just behind us, and the growl came again, louder this time. A growl that rumbled in my chest. We turned tail and bolted it out of those woods as fast as we could, and it felt like this thing was close behind. I can remember Haley falling when we reached the line between the woods and my backyard, and I remember dragging her by the arm until she caught her feet. I was still trying to catch a glance and trying to see if I saw anything, but I still saw nothing chasing us. We ran straight to the house and hid, looking from her bedroom window. We had a clear view from her window to our woods, yet nothing ever came out. We didn't go into the woods for a while, and even so, we only enter a couple of feet before we'd feel like we were being watched. My brother and his friend had a similar run-in, but luckily had their quads. They were further in the woods and were fishing, just like our day. He said it started to get cloudy and colder, kind of out of the blue, and he said he heard someone on the trail further down. This is opposite of where the trail goes from our house. It's deeper in towards a waterfall. He said it sounded like someone was riding their horse down towards them. He called out to them because he didn't want the rider or the horse to get spooked, since everything is kind of on a bend. Instead of a voice, a growl was the response. He then said he and Gary didn't waste any time. They left all their tackle and poles and flew home on the quads. I hadn't told my brother about what happened to me and Haley, but I think these occurrences are definitely connected. What do you guys think?
My Worst Camping Experience by Kenzie W. So I'm a 13-year-old female, and at the time I was 11. This was my first summer camp, and being stupid and the younger kid I was, I thought it would be fine. On my first night, a girl tried to kill another girl by stopping me from reporting the counselors that the girl's insulin pump was beeping. The girl who wanted me to stop, let's call her Jordan, she held me down in my bed, by my shoulders. She held her hand over my mouth, with a grin creeping onto her face as the girl whose insulin pump was beeping a lot, we will call her Linda, stirred unknowingly. I managed to throw Jordan off me to save Linda by reporting it to the counselors. On day 2, I learned Jordan and Tiffany were good friends. Tiffany had 50 pounds on my 80-pound self-soaking wet. That day of camp, we went swimming in the pool, and I was talking to Linda about the night prior and making sure she was feeling better. Tiffany, as I later found out, had a big crush on Linda, and Linda did not feel the same way. So, as Linda and I were talking, Tiffany swam up behind me and pushed me to the bottom of the 7-foot pole and stood on my head. As I previously stated, she had a decent amount of weight on me. Hence, I thought I was definitely going to die because it was tough to get her off of me. I was nearly about to drown. She nearly killed me. I saw my life flash before my eyes. And oh my god, I was wasting my life. The best thing to ever happen to me was the scariest thing, because without my brush with drowning, I would probably still be spending my life doing nothing. So in a way, I thank her for almost killing me. But that was my worst camping experience ever. Did we see a skinwalker? By Anonymous. My mom was in the army long ago. She did her time a few years ago. She felt a void in her heart like something wasn't there. And then she found her love for camping and hiking. My mom has been a camper for about 6 years now. She has planned every year for her hiking and camping trips. She has gone hiking and camping in the summer, spring, fall, and hell, even in the winter in the same mountains, all while bringing my brother along as her hiking and camping buddy. And it's to the point that the little town, before you head into the mountains, knows my mom and brother by name, often calling them the mom who hikes with her son. I live with my dad, and usually I visit her and my brother over the summer. Last year was my last time hiking and camping with her and my brother, and honestly, I'm not too fond of those mountains and what lies in those woods. The mountains we hike in are called Pine Creek Gorge, or in this case, the Grand Canyon of Pennsylvania. The West Rim Trail is a 30-mile hiking trail. When I say I'm not too fond of these mountains, I really mean it. My mom wanted to beat a new record with my brother and me and hike this 30-mile trail in under 47 hours. I didn't argue and agreed that we could probably do it. But in reality, I absolutely could not believe my mom. You have to park your car at the trail's standing point, which is at Brady Wallace's picnic area. Then you have to hike to Rattlesnake Rock, and then you have to hike another 10 miles down the mountain to get to a little town where you can get sandwiches, sodas, and a ride back to the picnic area. We had met about halfway through our hike. It was getting dark, and we needed to set up camp. Luckily, we were at a campsite made for this. We were high up in the mountains and had a nice view. The woods surrounded us. My mom and I set up the tent, and my brother set up the inside. We changed into our so-called PJs and created a massive fire. This definitely helped us keep warm, repel insects and animals and all that good stuff. We then cook some food, eat, and my mom hangs up the food bag in the tree to keep animals away from it. Remember that food bag? After this, we went to sleep. And that's when it happened. I remember waking up in the middle of the night. It's pitch black and blurry. I don't know why I woke up, I just did. And that's when I heard it. I don't know how to describe it fully. It sounded like a porcupine call, but deeper and like it was not natural. I sat there for what felt like about 5 minutes, but it was like hell. I heard shifting around the tent as if something was walking towards us. It stops, and I listened to the sound of water pouring. That's when it hit me. It was peeing next to our tent on my side. I kept hearing shuffles around our campsite. I could turn around to see my mom figure upright up in the tent. She asked in my lowest voice if I had heard it as well. I replied that I did, and we waited just a few more minutes. My mom finally got up, took her machete, bear mace, and banded flashlight, and went outside to investigate. If you are wondering where my brother is now, he's still asleep. And to those wondering why he's not really helping us out, well, let me give you a little bit of background. My brother was 11 years old, tall, skinny, and had a baby face like no other. So having a 40-year-old army mom stationed in Afghanistan with a license to kill was probably the best way to go. Anyway, I waited a few minutes with my mind rushing. What was outside? Is my mom okay? Is it fight or flight? Where do I go? When I was thinking about what would happen, my mom accidentally hits the tent with bear mace. My brother and I started to cough, feeling our lungs suffocating through this mace. We ran out of the tent into the night. We could only see the small fire pit still burning and my mom standing outside looking frantic. She asked why we are out, and I told her about the mace. She said she was sorry and we stood in silence. I kept my side beside the fire, and eyes glued to the deep dark forest around us. My mom said she saw nothing outside. About a good 20 minutes go by, making sure the mace evacuated our tent. We finally went back down to lay down. My brother somehow went back to sleep, but my mom and I, surprisingly, couldn't. In the distance I heard a pack of coyotes howling, and I remember all the skinwalker stories I had learned throughout my life. My eyes felt heavy, and I fell asleep after some time. When we woke up, I first walked the place up and down looking for any signs of whatever we had experienced. Wherever this thing had peed, wherever it had stood, we looked for any signs of proof. There was nothing that I could figure out. The only thing that was strange after this was that the food bag had somehow had all the food removed, even though it was still hanging up in the tree. We were all wide-eyed, with our mouths gaping open. We had no explanation for this. Whatever was making those sounds, peeing next to our tent, stealing our food, I really don't know what to say. I have no idea what it could be other than some otherworldly creature. Wendigo in the Woods by Anonymous. So about 3 years ago I went camping with my girlfriend, now ex, as she had always expressed interest but had never actually been camping. The spot we went to is the Huron National Forest, and is my go-to trail and camp spot as it's hidden deep in the forest, and the access to the trail is pretty much effortless for ATVs. My family has been going to this spot for about 6 years, and my friends introduced me about 10 or so years ago. We went on a weekend trip, and I'm glad we didn't go any longer. When we got there, everything was going well, except we did notice a group of people hanging out next to our campsite, but we were just stargazing and ended up leaving after some time. Then, around midnight, the weird stuff began to happen. At first, it sounded like someone was laughing at us, but never, ever ending. It was just very high-pitched, and it was like it kept going on a loop without ever taking a breath. After some time, we both kind of got scared, and went into the tent to try to sleep, and that's when the laughter, noise, whatever it was, moved up higher. And then we began to hear whatever it was circle the campsite. After a while, it suddenly stopped and started again around 3 a.m. When it began again, the fire was going out, so I went to stoke the fire with my shotgun and turned on my flashlight to see if I could see any coyotes or something around the campsite. But I didn't see anything or hear any movements. This went on until 6 a.m., and then it suddenly stopped. That was finally when we could get some rest. After waking up a few hours later, we checked the campsite and saw nothing unusual, so we packed up. Once we were packed up and good to go, I started my vehicle, which was completely dead. That freaked me out as I'm always paranoid about having things plugged in that kill the batteries. I also got a brand new battery for this car right before this trip. I pretty much ensured that everything would be correct, but somehow it was dead. So, I don't really know how to explain this. Eventually, I was able to flag down a lady who was able to call somebody to come tow us. After that happened, I told my friend once I got home, who had shown me the campsite. They also had stories about a cabin in the same forest roughly 25 miles away. He told me about some things that happened to him recently, and I got even more freaked out. It wasn't just our campsite or just our experience. Things were happening all over this area. While hanging out, he just was looking off in the distance, and one day, he said he saw a pair of eyes up in the trees looking directly at him. He described them as bioluminescent eyes. He flashed his high-powered flashlight at them. Still, it was like there was nothing there, and as soon as the flashlight turned off, it's like they were right back once again staring back at him. He didn't tell anybody for quite some time because he didn't want to scare us or have us think that he was crazy.
I'll never camp in Yellowstone ever again. By Adventurous Mark, 45. Personally, I've always loved camping, and Yellowstone National Park has been on my bucket list for many years. The thought of experiencing the park's stunning natural beauty up close and personal had always excited me, but little did I know that my camping trip to Yellowstone would be a horrific nightmare I would never, ever have the chance to forget. My friend and I arrived at the park and set up our tent at a campsite deep in the woods. It was the perfect spot, really, away from the hustle and bustle of other campers, and we were thrilled to be surrounded by the tranquility of nature. The first few days were everything we had honestly hoped it would be. We hiked through the forest, spotted wildlife, and enjoyed the park's scenic views. But things started to turn dark on the third day of our trip. We were on a hike when we heard strange noises from the woods. At first, we assumed it was just the wildlife, but as the noises grew louder and we realized something was not quite right, a low guttural growl made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. We tried to ignore it and continued on our hike, but the growling followed us. Finally, we started to feel like we were being watched, and the hairs on our arms stood on end. That's when we saw a dark, shadowy figure lurking in the woods. It was too far away to make out any specific features, but we could tell it was massive and not of this world. As we returned to our campsite, the growling continued to follow us. We tried to keep our cool, but the fear was too much. When we finally returned to our tent, we locked ourselves inside and tried to ignore the growling outside. The night was long and terrifying. We could hear the creature outside scratching at our tent and making horrible sounds that filled us with absolute dread. After that, we barely slept, and when we did, it was fitful and filled with nightmares. When morning finally came, we packed our campsite as quickly as we could and left the park without ever looking back. To this very day, I really don't know what that creature was, but I have a very strong feeling that it was something beyond human understanding. The memory of that camping trip still haunts me, and I know I'll never be able to forget the horror of what happened in Yellowstone National Park. But please don't let that deter you from visiting. Overall, it still was a very, very serene place.
Fresh out of high school, my friends and I decided to take one last trip together before we all split up to go to college. The Pacific Crest Trail was the destination. A few nights of drinking, hiking, and camping was exactly what we needed together. Ian, my boyfriend, picks me up from my house. I've never been to the Pacific Crest Trail, so he tries describing its beauty the best he can. Babe, you're gonna love it, I promise. Nothing but fresh air and wilderness. We will be one with nature. I'm not so sure Mother Nature would approve of the ungodly amount of alcohol you have in the cooler. Well, what about this? Ian pulls out a sandwich-sized Ziploc bag of weed. I know Mother Nature would approve of this. She grew it. You've been holding out on me, I said, snatching the bag from his grip. I open it and take a deep breath, inhaling the familiar aroma. It's a long ride. Might as well roll one up for the road. Sounds good. I'll call the others and get them to meet us at the location. Ian connects his phone on his Jeep radio, putting on his 80s hair metal playlist. I light the freshly rolled joint, and we settle in for a road trip. We decided to meet up at the Bridge of Gods. The Bridge of the Gods sits at the convergence of the historic Columbia River Highway State Trail, 3 National Historic Trails, and the Pacific Crest Trail. We walk over the bridge together, being extra careful because there is no shoulder on the narrow bridge, and we must share with cars and trucks. We make it across with no problem and hike for a while until we decide to go off-trail to find a spot to set up camp by the river. 3 tents between 6 people. Nova and his girlfriend Tessa, the twins, Sadie and Katie, and finally myself and Ian. I sit back with a black cherry white claw and take in the beautiful, beautiful surroundings. The sky let out an orange glow as the sun sank behind the jagged mountains. The mountains came down to meet the cold, untamed river. Nova and Ian began to make a fire before the night came. As the darkness falls, the alcohol flows. The flicker of the flame lights the night. We all reminisce about high school and talk about all that we would like to do for our future. Ian gets quiet and stares off into the darkness that is the river. "What's up, Ian?" I ask. "I think I can see the outline of a boat floating not far off the bank." We all look in that direction. Ian pointed. "Yeah, I think I see it too," Katie said. Nova walks over to his backpack and pulls something out. He twirls it in his hand and looks at it for a moment, before putting it in the direction of what we think is the boat. "Is that a gun? Put that up, Nova." I spoke. "Chill out, Brittany. It's just a flare gun," Ian said as he grabbed my hand to calm me. Nova pulls the trigger, and a trail of light streaks out towards the boat. It lights up the immediate area around the dark outline. It was a boat. Not just our mind playing tricks on us in the dark. 2 people stood in the flat-bottomed boat, looking our way. They wore orange hoodies that hid their face. "Oh my god, people are watching us," Sadie said. "Get the hell out of here, you damn weirdos," Nova shouted. Nova and Ian began picking up rocks on the riverbank and throwing them at the boat. After a few moments, we could hear the engine start and drive away. We finally get over being freaked out. We did our best to put the incident behind us and continued drinking and partying throughout the night before eventually passing out in our tents. I woke the following day to a commotion outside. I unzipped the tent and dragged myself out. The sun hit my eyes, and I winced as a sharp pain shot through my head. Drinking obscene amounts of alcohol seems like a great idea until the next day, when you have to wake up with a splitting headache and you get a queasy gut. I see Ian with his hands clasped on top of his head, standing in front of a flat-bottomed boat and sat on the riverbank on our campsite. "Ian, what's wrong? What's going on?" I ask. "These assholes from last night, they docked our boat here and stole all of our supplies while we were sleeping." Nova walks up behind us. "I'm having trouble finding the trail. I have some food and water stashed away in my tent. Let's refuel and go look like a group." After eating, with no supplies, we decided to cut our trip short, pack up, and look for the trail we strayed from to get to this riverbank. "Let's split up," Nova said. "We can go in pairs of 2. Try not to stray too far from the others, so if you find the trail, you can alert the others by yelling." Nova and Tessa enter the woods. Sadie and Katie enter about 20 yards away, and Ian and I do the same. Ian grabs my hand and he leads the way. We say nothing to each other, only the sound of twigs breaking and brush under our feet fill the silence. "I think I see something," Ian said. I look around to try and see what he sees, and that's when I notice it. I think we both figure out what it was at the same time by the terrified look we gave each other. To our left, a man in a bright orange hunting hoodie stood several yards away. He didn't move. He just looked at us. A camouflage ski mask covered his face. He didn't move even when we ran into the opposite direction of him. Even without being chased, we ran as fast as we could, leading to me tripping over some undergrowth and falling. My extended hands were the only thing stopping me from slamming my face into the unforgiving ground. A sharp pain shot through my wrist into my elbow. I let out a yelp in pain. I'm not sure if it's broken, but I know it's at least sprained. The price I had to pay to save my face from colliding with the forest floor. Ian quickly comes to my side, helping me up and inspecting the hand. I held it close to my body. He flexed the wrist, sending a shockwave of pain through my arm, causing me to jerk my hand away. Behind him, I noticed some movement. It was one of the men in the orange hoodie stepping out from behind some trees. I point a shaky finger behind Ian at the man. Ian glances over his shoulder to see what has me so shaken. "We'll check this out later. Right now we have to run." Ian grabs my elbow, careful not to touch my hurt wrist. We make a hard left and quickly make our way to what is hopefully the trail we came in on. We break through the trees, but it's not the trail. It's a small clearing. It looks like someone has recently been here. A still smoldering fire set in the center of the small clearing. Sadie and Katie break through the brush into the clearing a few feet away from where we came in, followed by Nova and Tessa shortly, to the right of where we came in. We all share stories, and they all sound very similar. "These men funneled us to this spot," Katie said. "Why do they want us here? What do they want?" Nova responded. "Well, you did shoot a flare at them," I say to Nova. "The creeps were floating there watching us. What was I supposed to do?" "Stop fighting. It'll get us nowhere. We need to figure out how to get back to the trail," Sadie interrupted. We looked around the clearing. It was roughly about half the size of an NFL football field. There was nothing out of the ordinary other than the smoldering pile of coals left behind. "Let's turn around together and enter the woods and search for the trail. It has to be close," Ian said. We began to walk towards the section of woods we had entered the clearing through, and several of the men with orange hoodies and camouflage masks stepped out of the tree line. We turned as a group and began running in the opposite direction. We got halfway to the other side of the clearing before there were more men wearing the same orange hunting hoodies and camouflage masks stepping out. More emerged from the tree line surrounding us. I'm pretty sure there were 12 of them in total. Some of them had rifles in hand. Our group huddles together as it looked like these hunters were slowly closing in around us. 2 hunters grab the twins, Sadie and Katie, and begin to drag them away, kicking and screaming. Ian and Nova run towards the 2 hunters that grab the twins. Nova throws a punch that connects with the hunter's chin and drops him to the ground. Nova grabs Sadie by the hand to help her up when a loud boom fills the air. The unexpected explosion temporarily disorients me. My ears ring. I look around confused about what just happened and where the explosion came from. I hear Sadie let out a terrified scream. I look to see her coated in blood and Nova lying on the ground beside her. Ian turns around, running away from the scene unfolding before us. The look of fear in his face let me know exactly what had just happened. One of the hunters with a rifle had shot Nova. Ian took about 2 steps before another shot rang out. Blood spray came out of the side of Ian's head like a lawn sprinkler. Ian drops mid-stride, pulls her into the nearest tree line, and I hush her violent screams. No additional words are needed as we began to both sprint away from the chaos. I feel terrible about leaving Sadie and Katie to die. But any other action than what I took would have led to all of our deaths. I could hear the hunters scrabbling after us. At least, that's what was running through my mind at that moment. Tessa and I ran full speed for what felt like miles. My legs burned, my lungs hurt, and I would not dare to slow down. To my relief, we stumbled upon the trail. I look around to regain my sense of direction. "The bridge is this way," I yelled to Tessa, and we began sprinting again. We ran to the bridge, where we flagged down a car, and they called the emergency number to alert the police. I was frantic, trying to explain to the officer what I saw, that we ran off, leaving our friends to die. Tessa could only weep. She tried to tell her version, but she couldn't get the words out. Tessa was physically shaking, and instead of words, vomit was the only thing that came from her mouth. Several hours had passed, and the sun was starting to set when the officers found my friends. The hunters had erected 2 wooden crosses that Sadie and Katie hung from. Their abdomens sliced open, and the twins were connected by their intestines tied together. Their guts decorated the wooden structure they hung from like a set of gory Christmas lights. Ian and Nova lay at the foot of the crosses. I don't know the reason behind the gruesome slaughter of my friends, but I do know I'll never revisit the Pacific Crest Trail.